very much. Let me start with just a little bit more pessimism before I get underway. I can't help it this morning. One of the big problems in all of the public discussion and public confidence, public response, is that we have very few, almost no trusted voices of authority in the world right now. Politicians are not trusted for good reason, and our societies are divided. And I'm going to say something extremely provocative that will shock you, and I don't mean to, and I don't want it to be misunderstood. But the scientists also have not behaved well in this pandemic. And there is, unfortunately, another bombshell that could hit us, which could be devastating socially. And that is, there is a real chance that this virus was created in a laboratory by US and Chinese research. I've been looking at this for 2 years, day by day. It's far from sure, but it's also far from not sure. And what is sure is that those in charge have not allowed a proper investigation of this issue. And so there's a deep reason for a lack of confidence and public understanding, because there's something hidden going on very bad. And last week, the National Institutes of Health released the latest documents in a Freedom of Information Act released, 314 pages, in which they blanked out entirely 290 pages. Entire redaction of 290 of 314 pages. That's Fauci, and we expect him to be the voice of trust, but he will not be the voice of trust because he's under assault, not only for vaccines, but for this issue. And it will take time to get to the bottom of this one way or another. And so I'm just telling you that we're in for a wild period, unfortunately. And there are almost no trusted voices in the world right now. So the divisions are going to be extremely dangerous. And I'll say no more about that unless anyone wants to know, but and I also don't want to say that there's any conclusion one way or another, but there is absolutely no consensus among the very small group of scientists that really study this or know this intensively about what laboratory work was underway and what the risks are that it came out of the lab versus out of nature. And if you read the New York Times a couple of days ago that said, well, now we've determined it came from the market, this is completely debunked inside a very high elite circle of virologist experts who say it's nonsense. One wrote to me laughing, said, this was dismissed in the early days of January 2020. This is nonsense. One of the top people in the world on this. So this is where we are. It's really not good, this situation. And the pandemic is hardly over. And the war is hardly begun. Because unless a miracle occurs of compromise, we're on a path of escalation. Because the men that run the world don't know how to de-escalate. They only know how to escalate. And so this is why it's so extraordinarily dangerous. And every analogy to the past, you don't appease, you don't do this, that was in a non-nuclear era. This is the first time we're doing this with Russia with 6,000 nuclear warheads and the United States with 6,000 nuclear warheads. So all the lessons of history are naive, how they're stated. And every word coming out of capitals is naive right now. So just why I'm really in a pessimistic mood. I want to talk about the economics of education, but not what the pandemic has done. And the reason I want to do that is the pandemic made everything worse, but it was completely terrible beforehand. And so nothing that the pandemic has done has changed the basic fact that we weren't attending to things even before, when we didn't have a pandemic and when we had peace. And I want to explain the basics of this economics in a very straightforward way, because it's crucial if this world's ever going to work right. So we already had in the wonderful presentation that we heard from the middle of the night from Cambridge, the World Bank classification, which is very helpful. Upper income or high income countries, upper middle income countries, lower middle income countries, and low income countries. And this map shows that division. So the dark green are the high income countries. The light green are the upper middle income countries. The light purple are the lower middle income countries, and the dark purple are the low income countries. The low income countries and the lower middle income countries constitute 51% of the world population. That's important because those countries do not and cannot afford a proper education for their children. That's 51% of the world population. I'll give you all the slides also. So here are some data to understand this. There are 27 low-income countries, 55 lower middle-income countries, 55 upper middle-income countries, 80 upper middle-income countries. The GDP per capita, that is national income per capita, averages $692 in the low-income countries, up to $45,455 in the high-income countries. The young population, the population, as I've said, is 4 billion in the bottom half, 4 billion in the top half. So it's just about 50-50 right now. The poor countries have a much younger population because they have high fertility rates, so many more children. So in the poor countries, the young population, and by young, I mean under 25 years old, so school age from primary to tertiary, is 55% of the population. In the high-income countries, it's 23% of the population. So I want you to remember that, because now I want to look at the basic economics of this. The basic economics is that the low-income countries spend $27 billion on education. The high-income countries spend $3.2 trillion. That's 6% of the GDP of the low-income countries, and almost exactly the same, 5.9% of the GDP of the high-income countries. But the spending per capita is $42 per capita on education in the low-income countries, compared with $2,670 per capita in the high-income countries. The spending per young person is even more distorted because there are many more young people in the poor countries. So the poor countries spend $75 per young person per year. The high-income countries spend $11,187 per young person per year. That's total spending. But in poor countries, most of the spending is actually not by government because the government's broke. So it's by the upper crust of the poor countries. So if you look at just government spending, the low-income countries are spending $33 per, $33 per young person compared to $9,426 per young in the upper income countries. This is the bottom line that I want you to understand, that poor countries can't afford education, pure and simple. They can't afford education. They're extremely poor. Why are they poor? There's a whole history. One part of the history is 100 years of colonial rule, which, by the way, had as its most central feature, don't educate the natives, because that is the pillar, the cornerstone of imperialism, which we should understand, so that when Africa decolonized, there were a handful of people with a high school education across tropical Africa after 100 years of colonial rule. But the spending is $33 per young person right now. And the results are in every data pre-pandemic that you can imagine. Life expectancy of schooling means how many years of schooling do you expect? A handful in Africa, in Western Asia, and in most of South and much of Southeast Asia. A handful of years compared to 15 years in the high-income world. Primary completion rates in 2020, less than half. Kids aren't in school. Gross enrollment rates. Gross means, by the way, usually it can be well over 100% because it's the number of people in school over the age-specific category. Gross enrollment rates in secondary education, well under half, usually under a quarter in the poor countries. Pre-pandemic. Average learning outcomes, it goes with the spending, not surprisingly. You spend little, you don't get outcomes. It's on that upward sloping line. Growth, by the way, of GDP per capita fits almost perfectly on a line with test scores. The most important single component of economic development by far is education, by far. Because if the labor force is educated, the rest of capital comes in. If the labor force isn't educated, all you have is mining and oil. That's the only thing you can produce. Even the labor-intensive jobs are gone in this world. Machines do everything that used to be done, cutting, stitching, putting things on motherboards. All the things that 50 years ago were the stepping stones of development are gone because machines do them. Sonia and I went to a Huawei factory in southern China a couple of years ago, just before the pandemic. And we were on the assembly line, and they told us that the year before they had 1,200 jobs on this 1 kilometer assembly line. When we were there, there were 80 jobs because all the rest was little robots lifting the phones, taking them to the next stall. The jobs are gone. And that's happening across industry. So education is the only resource that a country really has for development. So this is, again, showing that the spending of the low-income countries, the blue is what households spend, the purple is what government spends, and the amounts are the absolute billions of dollars, how tiny they are. So I've been trying for 20 years to help raise funding for education. Many of you have heard this little speech before, I'm afraid. For 20 years, no success at all. Governments are not interested. Our government's not interested. U.S. government is hopeless, by the way, on everything. Across all administrations, period. This is my professional experience of 40 years. I can summarize. It does matter. It's better not to have a psychopath as president. But other than that, it barely matters, because our government is in the hands of a few billionaires and campaign contributors anyway, so it hardly matters at all. But there's no interest in funding poor kids in school. And Stefania knows it's her job to mobilize for this, and it's my job to help her do so. What we call the Global Partnership for Education is about $700 million a year or so. That's the partnership. That's nothing. So I want to emphasize, the pandemic made everything worse. It has probably deranged us geopolitically also. God knows how it's going to spread with this war and the refugees also, because we're not at the end of this pandemic, and now we're going to have millions of people on the move. And that's where the Spanish flu, by the way, that is the greatest PR in the world. A flu that started in the United States got called the Spanish flu in the end. Only America could pull that off. But who knows what this is going to do in addition. Two final points that I would say. One possible piece of good news, and I look to Marcelo and education experts, at least online is very low cost. At least you can have teachers anywhere by being online, in essence. If we could have a revolution of technology that made it possible to have everyone with a device and everyone online, could educators use that? Not perfect, but we're in a desperate situation. I'm in discussions with Google and others about how to accelerate universal access, because technically it's not expensive and it doesn't even require hardware now, it's software. And so it's not impossible to have a massive increase of access, and the devices now, a smartphone is well under $100. So even a physical device in the hand is possible. I don't know with any assurance whether this could be a decisive breakthrough, but I offer it as one possibility. The other is just to say, we cannot rely on governments now. We need to hope that they don't get us all killed, because that's the main thing that we need from them right now, because they're so stupid and it's so out of control right now. There's a tremendous amount of wealth in the world outside of government, by design, by the way, because the whole purpose of government is to keep that wealth nice and safe and intact, as John Locke taught the Americans and the British. So there's a tremendous amount of private wealth. I'm wondering whether a tremendous amount of private wealth and some low-cost devices and online connectivity could address this crisis in a new way. Because I'm not waiting around for President Biden to get a new appropriation through the US Congress on finance for poor kids. It's not going to happen. And Germany just announced a massive increase of military spending. I'll tell you what that's going to mean for development aid. Our dream has come true. Germany is militarizing again. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.